Hey guys! Tonight we're diving into the greatest tales ever told. Stories of gods and monsters, of heroes who defied fate, and of moments so powerful they shaped the world we still live in today. These weren't just legends. To the ancient Greeks, they were history. Every temple, every statue, every whisper in the wind carries a piece of these myths. And tonight, you'll hear the very best of them. Before we begin, if you enjoy quiet, dark stories from the past, feel free to support the channel with a free subscription. And tell me, where are you watching from right now? I read every comment. It's always amazing to see people tuning in from all over the world. Now take a deep breath and settle in. This is Myth Night, where you relax, and I tell you true stories from the forgotten past. And if you fall asleep before the end, that's okay. Some stories were made to be finished in dreams. Tonight, we gather the greatest stories ever told, tales that have captivated human imagination for over 3,000 years, and continue to shape how we understand heroism, love, tragedy, and the very nature of existence itself. These aren't just ancient myths gathering dust in forgotten libraries. They are living stories that pulse with truths about human nature, stories so powerful they've survived the rise and fall of empires, so universal they speak to every generation that discovers them. From the birth of the cosmos to the fall of Troy, from gods who ruled with thunderbolts to heroes who defied impossible odds, these tales weave together into one magnificent tapestry that reveals both the heights and depths of what it means to be alive in this mysterious universe. Each story we'll explore tonight has been chosen because it captures something essential about the human experience, our capacity for both creation and destruction, our ability to love so deeply it transcends death itself, and our eternal struggle to find meaning in a world that often seems beyond our control. These myths are timeless because they're honest about life's complexity. They don't promise easy answers or simple morals, but they do offer something more valuable: the wisdom that comes from watching others face impossible choices and discovering what truly matters when everything else falls away. Tonight, you'll meet gods who are gloriously flawed, heroes who triumph through failure, and lovers whose devotion reshapes the very laws of reality. So settle back and let these ancient voices guide you through landscapes where anything is possible, where love can move mountains and pride can topple kingdoms, where the choices made by beings both mortal and divine echo across eternity. The greatest stories ever told are waiting to unfold, and by journey's end, you'll understand why these myths have never stopped speaking to the human heart. In the beginning, there was only chaos, not the disorder we imagine today, but something far more profound and mysterious. Picture the deepest silence you've ever experienced, then multiply it by infinity. Imagine the most complete darkness, then realize even that comparison fails to capture what existed before existence itself. Chaos was the void that contained every possibility, but had realized none of them, the pregnant emptiness from which everything would eventually emerge. From this primordial nothingness came the first stirrings of consciousness. Gaia, the earth, didn't appear in any way we might recognize. She was the very concept of substance and stability, the first solid foundation in a universe of pure potential. Her awakening was like the first note of music in a world that had never known sound, the first glimpse of color in endless gray. As Gaia gained awareness of herself, she felt something that even primordial beings could experience: loneliness. She was the only solid reality in an ocean of possibilities, the only consciousness with actual form. So, from her own essence, she brought forth Uranus, the sky, vast and blue and infinite, stretching above her like a dome that touched the very edges of imagination. Together, Gaia and Uranus formed the first partnership in creation. Earth and sky, solid and ethereal, stability and change. From their union came children so magnificent and terrible that they would define the next great age of existence, the Titans. These beings were powers unto themselves, each embodying fundamental forces of the cosmos. Kronos controlled time itself, feeling every moment stretch and compress according to his will. Rhea brought fertility and growth, teaching the world how to change and flourish. Oceanus became the great river that encircled all lands, while Hyperion carried within himself the light that would eventually become the sun. But parenthood, even among primordial gods, came with complications that would echo through every generation to follow. Uranus, looking upon his strange and powerful children, felt the first stirring of a fear that would haunt divine families forever: the terror of being surpassed by one's own offspring. Rather than celebrate their potential, Uranus chose to contain it. One by one, he forced his children back into Gaia's womb, trapping them in the deep places of the earth where their power could grow but never challenge his authority. The Cyclopes, with their single eyes that could forge lightning itself, vanished into hidden forges far beneath the surface. The Hecatoncheires, the hundred-handed giants whose strength could move mountains, were bound in darkness so complete that even their many eyes could see nothing. Gaia endured this cruelty as long as she could, but even the earth has limits to its patience. When Kronos, her youngest and cleverest son, was born, she had prepared something from her own substance, a sickle made from the hardest stone in existence, sharp enough to cut divine flesh and strong enough to wound the sky itself. The moment came when Uranus descended to imprison his newest child. Gaia pressed the weapon into Kronos' hands and whispered a single word that would change everything: now. What followed was swift and brutal. Kronos struck with the precision of someone who had spent his entire brief existence planning this moment. The sickle bit deep, and Uranus cried out in pain and shock, his divine blood falling like silver rain upon the earth below. But this wasn't ordinary blood. This was the life force of the sky itself, and where it touched the ground, new life immediately began to spring forth. From these drops came the Furies, goddesses of vengeance, who would forever pursue those who committed crimes against family. The giants rose from this blood as well, beings of enormous strength who would one day challenge the gods themselves. And most beautifully of all, from the blood that fell into the sea came Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, rising from the foam like a pearl from an oyster. As Uranus retreated to the highest reaches of the sky, wounded and furious, he spoke words that would haunt his attacker forever. Just as you have overthrown me, so too will one of your own children overthrow you. The cycle of violence you have begun today will not end with you. But Kronos, drunk on victory and the taste of power, paid little attention to his father's prophecy. He had won. The age of the Titans had begun, and he would not make the same mistakes Uranus had made, or so he believed, as he settled into a throne that would prove far less secure than he imagined. The Titans ruled during what many consider the golden age of divine history. They governed with a light touch, allowing the world to develop according to its own natural rhythms. This was a time when the boundary between the divine and natural worlds was almost non-existent, when gods walked openly among their domains, and the earth itself pulsed with visible magic. But Uranus's curse was already working its way through fate, and Kronos would soon discover that some prophecies are self-fulfilling, that the very fear of being overthrown can create the conditions that make overthrow inevitable. The greatest stories are often about how trying to prevent destiny actually ensures it comes to pass, and the tale of Kronos would prove no exception to this ancient truth. Yet before we witness his downfall, we must first understand what rose from the ashes of his reign. A new generation of gods whose stories would define Western civilization's understanding of divinity, power, and the complex relationship between fate and free will. The prophecy that haunted Kronos came true in the most unexpected way. When his wife Rhea bore their first child, the Titan king felt terror overwhelm his judgment. Rather than risk being overthrown, as he had overthrown his father, Kronos chose a solution so monstrous it shocked even the cosmos itself. He devoured the infant immediately after birth. This pattern continued with horrifying regularity. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, each child was swallowed before they could draw their first free breath. But the babies didn't die in the darkness of their father's stomach. Instead, they grew to divine adulthood in that terrible prison, gaining power while remaining trapped, their strength building like pressure in a sealed container. When Zeus was born, Rhea had finally reached her breaking point. She spirited the infant away to a hidden cave on the island of Crete, where he was nursed by the goat Amalthea and protected by the Curetes, who clashed their shields to mask his cries. In place of her son, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Kronos, who swallowed the deception without question. Zeus grew up knowing exactly what his father had done, understanding that his siblings remained trapped and suffering while he enjoyed freedom. This knowledge shaped him into something different from previous generations of divine rulers, a god who understood that power without justice was ultimately self-destructive. When Zeus returned as a fully grown god, he brought with him a potion that would force Kronos to vomit up his children. One by one, they emerged, not as the infants they had been when swallowed, but as magnificent adult gods, each radiating power and barely contained fury at their father's crimes. What followed was the Titanomachy, a war that would literally reshape the foundations of existence. This wasn't just a conflict between different generations of gods, but a battle between two completely different philosophies of divine rule. The Titans fought to maintain a system based on fear and absolute control, where power was hoarded and threats were eliminated before they could develop. The younger gods fought for something unprecedented: shared authority, delegated responsibility, and governance based on cooperation rather than domination. The war lasted 10 years, with battles that made the earth shake and split the sky with divine fire. Zeus proved himself a different kind of leader by freeing the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires from their underground prisons. These ancient beings, grateful for their liberation, became his most powerful allies. The Cyclopes forged weapons that would tip the balance, thunderbolts for Zeus, a trident for Poseidon, and a helmet of invisibility for Hades. When the Titans finally fell, Zeus didn't repeat his predecessor's mistakes. Instead of ruling alone, he divided the cosmos among his siblings, creating a new form of divine government. Poseidon took dominion over all waters, from the smallest streams to the vastest oceans. Hades accepted rule over the underworld and the dead, understanding that death was as important as life in the cosmic order. The goddesses too received their spheres of influence, creating a divine administration that was more stable than any that had come before. Zeus established his court atop Mount Olympus, the highest peak in Greece, where the air was so thin that mortal lungs could never draw breath. The palace he built there wasn't hidden in some distant realm, but visible to anyone who looked up at the sky, a constant reminder that the gods were present and watching over the world below. The 12 Olympians who gathered in this divine court each brought their own personality and domain to the cosmic order. Zeus himself ruled as king, wielding thunderbolts that could split mountains and embodying the principle of justice, though his personal life often contradicted the very ideals he was supposed to represent. Hera, his queen, presided over marriage and family, but her own marriage was a battlefield of jealousy and revenge that would fuel countless myths. She was magnificent in her anger, terrible in her vengeance, and absolutely committed to defending the institution of marriage, even when her own husband violated it repeatedly. Poseidon commanded the seas with moods as changeable as the waves themselves. He could calm the most violent storms or whip peaceful waters into ship-destroying fury. Sailors would pour wine into the sea before every voyage, understanding that their lives depended on earning his favor. Athena, born fully grown from Zeus's head, embodied wisdom and strategic warfare. Unlike the chaotic violence that Ares would represent, Athena fought only when fighting served justice, and she always preferred cleverness to brute force. Apollo brought music, poetry, prophecy, and healing to the world, driving the chariot of the sun across the sky each day. His beauty was legendary, but so was his pride, a combination that would lead to both magnificent creations and terrible punishments for those who dared to challenge him. Artemis, Apollo's twin, was the eternal huntress who protected wild creatures and young women with equal fierce devotion. She ran through moonlit forests with silver deer, her arrows never missing their targets. Aphrodite rose from the sea foam near Cyprus, already perfect in every detail. Her power over love was absolute. No mortal or immortal could resist her when she chose to exercise her influence. But her gifts came with a price, for the love she inspired could be as destructive as it was beautiful. Ares represented the brutal reality of warfare, not the noble conflict that Athena embodied, but raw violence and bloodshed. Even his fellow gods disliked him, understanding that his influence brought out the worst in both mortals and immortals. Hephaestus, despite his physical imperfections, was the master craftsman whose skills were unmatched in all creation. From his forges beneath volcanoes, he created wonders that blurred the line between art and magic. Demeter controlled the harvest and the fertility of the earth itself. Her joy brought abundance, but her grief could curse entire continents with famine. Hermes served as messenger of the gods, guide of souls, and protector of travelers, merchants, and thieves. His quick wit and quicker feet made him the perfect intermediary between divine and mortal worlds. Finally, good Hades, though he rarely visited Olympus, ruled the vast kingdom of the dead with grim efficiency, ensuring that every soul received exactly the judgment their earthly deeds had earned. Together, these 12 gods created a divine order that was more complex and more human than anything that had come before. They quarreled and cooperated, loved and betrayed, created and destroyed with all the passion and inconsistency of mortal personalities magnified to cosmic proportions. But it was through their interactions with the mortal world that the greatest stories would unfold, tales of heroism and hubris, love and loss, sacrifice and redemption that would capture the human imagination for millennia to come. The stage was set for myths that would define what it means to be human in a universe ruled by beings who were all too human themselves. In the early days of Olympian rule, when the gods were still establishing their authority over the newly ordered cosmos, a titan named Prometheus watched the latest of Zeus's creations with growing concern. Humanity huddled in caves, vulnerable to predators and the elements, while the gods enjoyed the warmth and illumination of divine fire in their mountain palace. These creatures had been given intelligence and potential, but they lacked the tools to realize either. Prometheus saw something in mortals that moved him beyond mere pity. He recognized a spark of divinity in their questioning minds, their stubborn persistence, their capacity for both creation and self-sacrifice. Against Zeus's explicit prohibition, he made a choice that would define the relationship between gods and mortals forever. He stole fire from the heavens and gave it to humanity. But this wasn't just ordinary flame, though that was part of the gift. This was the fire of knowledge itself, the spark that would allow humans to forge tools, build cities, create art, develop medicine, and gradually transform from helpless creatures into rivals of the gods themselves. In handing them this flame, Prometheus was giving humanity the power to shape their own destiny. Zeus's rage when he discovered this theft was apocalyptic. Thunder shook the earth for days, and lightning split the sky from horizon to horizon. The punishment he devised for Prometheus was as eternal as it was cruel. The Titan was chained to a mountain peak in the Caucasus, where every day an eagle would tear out his liver, and every night it would grow back, ready to be torn out again. The agony was designed to be endless, a divine reminder that defying Zeus's will carried consequences beyond mortal imagination. But Zeus's vengeance didn't end with Prometheus. If humanity wanted divine fire, they would pay a price for it. The king of the gods commissioned his fellow Olympians to create a woman from clay, each contributing something to her nature. Athena taught her domestic skills, Aphrodite granted her irresistible beauty, Apollo gave her musical talent, and Hermes bestowed upon her curiosity, so powerful it could never be satisfied. This woman was named Pandora, meaning all gifted, and she was sent to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, as a bride. She carried with her a sealed jar with strict instructions never to open it under any circumstances. The jar was beautiful, mysterious, and impossible to ignore, exactly as Zeus had intended. When Pandora finally lifted the lid, driven by the very curiosity the gods had placed in her nature, she released horrors beyond imagination. Disease and death, war and famine, jealousy and hatred, despair and madness poured out like a black cloud, spreading across the world to poison every aspect of human existence. But just as she moved to close the jar in horror at what she had unleashed, one last entity emerged: hope. Smaller and more fragile than the evils that had preceded it, but somehow more persistent, hope would give humanity the strength to endure whatever sufferings fate might bring. The story of Persephone reveals another aspect of divine brutality, wrapped in the deceptive beauty of changing seasons. Hades, lord of the underworld, had watched the young goddess from his dark realm, studying her habits as she picked flowers in sunlit meadows with her mother Demeter. When his desire finally overwhelmed his patience, he didn't court her or seek permission from her family. Instead, he simply took what he wanted. The earth split open beneath Persephone's feet as she reached for a particularly beautiful narcissus. Hades emerged in his chariot, pulled by black horses, seized the terrified goddess, and descended back into his realm before anyone could intervene. The abduction was swift, efficient, and absolutely final, or so it seemed. Demeter's grief when she discovered her daughter's disappearance was so complete that she withdrew her gifts from the world entirely. Crops withered in the fields, trees bore no fruit, and the earth itself seemed to die. Humanity faced extinction through starvation, and even the gods began to worry as their offerings and worship dwindled. But Hades had made one crucial error. He had forced Persephone to eat pomegranate seeds while in his realm, binding her to the underworld through the ancient laws of hospitality. When Zeus finally negotiated her release, those seeds meant she could never fully return to the upper world. She would spend part of each year as queen of the dead and part with her mother among the living, her annual departure and return creating the cycle of winter and spring. The myth of Perseus and Medusa shows how even acts of heroism could emerge from divine cruelty. Medusa hadn't always been a monster whose gaze turned living creatures to stone. She had once been a beautiful priestess in Athena's temple, but when Poseidon assaulted her in that sacred space, Athena's rage fell not on the god who had committed the crime, but on the victim who had been defiled there. The transformations of Medusa into a gorgon was presented as punishment, but it was really a form of divine abandonment, turning a victim into a weapon that would destroy anyone who looked upon her. Perseus's quest to bring back her head was supposed to be impossible, a suicide mission designed to rid King Polydectes of an inconvenient hero. But Perseus succeeded through a combination of divine gifts and mortal courage. Athena provided a polished shield that would allow him to see Medusa's reflection without meeting her deadly gaze. Hermes contributed winged sandals for swift escape. Hades lent his helmet of invisibility. Armed with these tools, Perseus approached the sleeping Gorgon, struck off her head while looking only at her reflection, and escaped before her sisters could avenge her death. The most famous of all heroic cycles belongs to Heracles, whose very existence was the result of Zeus's infidelity. Born to the mortal woman Alcmene, Heracles possessed strength beyond anything previously seen in a human, but his divine heritage also made him a target for Hera's jealousy from the moment of his birth. The 12 labors that would define his legend began as punishment for a crime committed in madness. Hera had driven him insane, and in his madness, he had killed his own wife and children. The oracle at Delphi decreed that he could only be purified by serving his cousin Eurystheus, king of Tyrants, for 12 years, performing whatever tasks the king assigned. Each labor seemed designed to be impossible. The Nemean lion's hide was impervious to weapons, So Heracles strangled it with his bare hands and wore its pelt as armor. The Hydra of Lerna grew 2 heads for every one that was cut off, until Heracles learned to cauterize the necks with fire to prevent regeneration. The Ceryneian hind was sacred to Artemis and could outrun any pursuer, but Heracles tracked it for a full year until it finally tired. But perhaps the most revealing labor was his descent into the underworld to capture Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of death. This task forced Heracles to confront his own mortality, to journey to the one place from which no living person had ever returned. When he succeeded, not through violence, but by asking Hades' permission and demonstrating the respect due to the Lord of the Dead, he proved that true heroism involved more than physical strength. The greatest and most tragic of all mythological conflicts began with what seemed like a simple beauty contest. At the wedding of Thetis and Peleus, Eris, goddess of strife, threw a golden apple inscribed for the fairest among the assembled gods. 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, each claimed the prize, and Zeus, unwilling to choose between them, appointed Paris, Prince of Troy, as judge. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe for his vote. Hera promised dominion over all of Asia. Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle, but Aphrodite's offer proved most appealing to a young man. She promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. That woman was Helen, already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. When Paris visited Sparta and fell in love with Helen, she returned his feelings, and they fled together to Troy. But this wasn't just an elopement. Helen's beauty had made her the most desired woman in Greece, and when she married Menelaus, all her other suitors had sworn an oath to defend that marriage against any threat. The result was the greatest coalition army ever assembled in the ancient world. For 10 years, the Greeks besieged Troy, with heroes on both sides performing deeds that would echo through history. Achilles proved that even the greatest warrior could be undone by pride and anger. Hector showed that nobility could exist even in defeat. Odysseus demonstrated that cleverness could triumph where strength failed. The war finally ended, not through heroic combat, but through deception. Odysseus designed a wooden horse, presented as a gift to the gods, but actually hollow and filled with Greek warriors. The Trojans, celebrating what they believed was their victory, brought the horse inside their walls. That night, the hidden warriors emerged, opened the gates for their army, and Troy fell in flames and blood. These myths, brutal and beautiful in equal measure, served as more than entertainment for the ancient Greeks. They were explorations of fundamental questions about justice, power, love, and the price of defying fate. They showed that even gods could be cruel and petty, that heroes were flawed and mortal, and that the greatest victories often came at terrible cost. But alongside these tales of violence and tragedy, the Greeks also told stories of love so powerful it could challenge death itself, of devotion so complete it could transform the very laws of reality. These gentler myths revealed another aspect of the human experience, our capacity for tenderness in a harsh world, for hope in the face of despair, for love that persists even when reason counsels surrender. Among all the tales of gods and heroes, none captures the power of love to transcend even death itself, like the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus possessed a gift that made him unique among mortals. When he played his lyre and sang, the very stones would weep, Wild beasts would lie down peacefully, and even the trees would lean closer to hear his music. His melodies could calm storms, heal the sick, and bring joy to hearts crushed by sorrow. When Orpheus fell in love with the beautiful nymph Eurydice, their wedding celebration was filled with such music that the gods themselves paused in their heavenly duties to listen. But on their wedding day, as Eurydice danced through a sunlit meadow, fate struck with terrible swiftness. A poisonous snake, hidden in the grass, bit her ankle, and within moments she was dead. Orpheus's grief was so complete that his music changed its very nature. Where once his songs had brought joy, now they carried such sorrow that listeners wept uncontrollably. The earth itself seemed to mourn with him. Flowers wilted at his approach, and even the sun appeared dimmer when he played. Unable to accept his loss, Orpheus made a decision that no mortal had ever attempted. He would descend into the underworld while still alive and demand his wife's return. Armed with nothing but his lyre and his overwhelming love, he walked paths that should have killed any living being, past dangers that should have turned him back, until he stood before the obsidian throne of Hades himself. What followed was perhaps the most beautiful performance in all of mythology. Orpheus sang of love and loss, of the beauty Eurydice had brought to the world, of the emptiness that her death had created. His music was so powerful that it stopped all activity in the underworld. The Furies wept, Tantalus forgot his eternal thirst, even Sisyphus paused in his endless task to listen. Hades and Persephone, who had seen countless souls beg for impossible favors, found themselves moved by a mortal's music. For the first time in the history of their realm, they agreed to release a soul from death, but with one condition. Eurydice could follow Orpheus back to the world of the living, but he must not look back at her until they both reached the surface. The journey began in hope and ended in tragedy. As they climbed through the dark passages toward the light, Orpheus could hear Eurydice's footsteps behind him, could sense her presence, but could not see her. Just as they approached the boundary between death and life, doubt overwhelmed him. What if Hades had deceived him? What if she wasn't really there? In a moment of weakness that would haunt him forever, he turned around. For an instant, he saw her face, radiant with love and joy at their almost reunion. Then she began to fade, her form becoming transparent as the underworld reclaimed her. "Farewell," she whispered, and was gone, this time forever. Orpheus had lost her twice, and the second loss was infinitely more painful because he had caused it himself. The story of Pygmalion reveals love's power to create life itself through sheer force of devotion. Pygmalion was a sculptor whose skill was legendary throughout Greece, but he had become disgusted by the behavior of mortal women and had sworn never to marry. Instead, he poured all his passion into his art, creating statues so lifelike they seemed to breathe. His masterpiece was a statue of a woman so beautiful that she made real women seem crude and imperfect by comparison. He carved her from the finest marble, spending months perfecting every detail: the curve of her lips, the arch of her eyebrows, the delicate lines of her hands. When he finished, the statue was so perfect that he found himself falling in love with his own creation. Pygmalion talked to the statue as if she were alive, brought her gifts of flowers and jewelry, kissed her marble lips despite their coldness. His love for this stone woman became so complete that he could no longer tell the difference between art and reality. He saw her breathe, imagined her eyes following his movements, believed she smiled when he entered the room. During the festival of Aphrodite, Pygmalion prayed to the goddess with desperate sincerity. "If you can grant any wish, let me have a wife like my ivory statue." But Aphrodite, moved by the sculptor's pure devotion, chose to give him something even better. She brought the statue itself to life. When Pygmalion returned home, he kissed the statue's lips as he had countless times before, but this time the marble grew warm beneath his touch. Color flowed into the pale stone, breath stirred in the previously still chest, and eyes that had always seemed almost alive finally opened and looked into his. The woman who had been carved from stone spoke his name and loved him as completely as he had loved her. The myth of Theseus and Ariadne shows how love can provide the keys to solving impossible problems, though it also reveals that gratitude doesn't always accompany heroism. Theseus, a prince of Athens, arrived in Crete as one of the 14 young Athenians sent every 7 years to be devoured by the Minotaur, a creature half man and half bull that lived in an elaborate labyrinth beneath King Minos's palace. Ariadne, the king's daughter, fell in love with Theseus the moment she saw him, knowing that even if he somehow managed to kill the Minotaur, he would die lost in the maze trying to find his way out. She provided him with a ball of thread. By tying one end to the entrance and unrolling it as he went deeper into the labyrinth, he would be able to retrace his steps after defeating the monster. The plan worked perfectly. Theseus found the Minotaur in the center of the maze, killed it in single combat, and followed Ariadne's thread back to freedom. Together with the other Athenian captives and Ariadne herself, he escaped from Crete under cover of darkness. But during their flight, Theseus revealed a side of his character that contrasted sharply with his heroic reputation. When they stopped on the island of Naxos, he abandoned Ariadne while she slept, sailing away with his rescued companions and leaving her stranded. Whether this was from fear of her father's pursuit, shame at owing his victory to a woman's help, or simple ingratitude, the myths don't explain. What they do record is that Ariadne woke to find herself alone on an unfamiliar shore, betrayed by the man she had saved. But the gods sometimes show mercy where mortals show cruelty. Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy, found Ariadne weeping on the beach and fell in love with her immediately. He offered her something Theseus never could, not just love, but immortality. When Ariadne became his bride, Dionysus placed her crown among the stars, where it shines still as the constellation Corona. The story of Echo and Narcissus explores love's potential for both devotion and destruction. Echo was a nymph cursed by Hera to repeat only the last words she heard spoken by others. She had fallen in love with the beautiful youth Narcissus, but her curse made it impossible for her to express her feelings directly. She could only echo his words back to him, creating conversations that revealed her presence without allowing her to speak her heart. Narcissus, renowned for his beauty, but also for his cruelty to those who loved him, rejected Echo as he had rejected countless others. Heartbroken, she faded away until nothing remained but her voice, forever repeating the words of others without being able to speak her own. The gods, angered by Narcissus's callous treatment of those who loved him, devised a perfect punishment. They caused him to fall in love with his own reflection in a clear pool. Unable to touch or possess the image he adored, Narcissus wasted away from longing, finally dying beside the water that showed him a love he could never consummate. Where his body lay, the first narcissus flower bloomed, beautiful and eternally alone. These love stories, whether they ended in triumph or tragedy, shared a common understanding. Love was a force powerful enough to challenge death, create life, and transform the very laws of reality. But they also showed that love required wisdom to guide it, that passion without understanding could destroy as easily as it could create. The Greeks told these stories not to discourage love, but to honor its complexity, to acknowledge that the same force that could move mountains could also break hearts, that the emotion capable of creating the greatest beauty was also capable of causing the deepest pain. They understood that love, like all the forces that shape human existence, was neither purely good nor purely evil, but simply powerful. And that power, whether mortal or divine, required wisdom to wield responsibly. These tales of love and loss, triumph and tragedy, would endure because they captured eternal truths about the human heart, truths that remain as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago when they were first told around fires in ancient Greece. As these ancient stories have woven themselves through our journey tonight, patterns have emerged that reveal why the Greeks told these particular tales, why they preserved them across generations, and why they continue to speak to hearts and minds separated from their origins by thousands of years and vast cultural changes. These weren't just entertainment or primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. They were sophisticated explorations of questions that every human being must face. How should power be used? What does it mean to love? How do we find meaning in the face of mortality? What happens when our highest aspirations conflict with our deepest flaws? The Greeks understood something profound about human nature that many modern stories forget. People are capable of being both noble and petty, wise and foolish, loving and cruel, sometimes within the span of a single day. Their myths didn't present heroes as perfect beings who always made correct choices, but as complex individuals whose greatest strengths often contain the seeds of their greatest weaknesses. Achilles, the finest warrior who ever lived, was undone by the same fierce pride that made him unbeatable in combat. Odysseus, whose cleverness saved him from impossible situations, was nearly destroyed by his need to boast about his achievements. Even the gods themselves exhibited this duality. Zeus brought justice to the cosmos, but couldn't remain faithful to his wife. Athena embodied wisdom, but could be ruthlessly vindictive when slighted. This psychological realism made the myths useful as guides for living. They showed that virtue wasn't about achieving perfection, but about making good choices despite being flawed, about learning from mistakes rather than avoiding them entirely. The heroes who succeeded weren't those who never failed, but those who found ways to transform their failures into wisdom. The concept of hubris, excessive pride that invites divine punishment, served as one of the Greeks' most important moral teachings. But it wasn't just about staying humble in the face of divine power. Hubris represented the danger of losing perspective, of becoming so focused on immediate goals that you forget the larger patterns of cause and effect that govern existence. When mortals committed hubris, they weren't just offending the gods, they were violating the fundamental principle of balance that kept the cosmos functioning. Pride that grew too great disrupted the natural order, creating instabilities that had to be corrected. The divine punishment that followed wasn't arbitrary revenge, but a necessary restoration of equilibrium. This understanding of cosmic balance influenced every aspect of Greek society. Their political systems emphasized the dangers of concentrated power. Their philosophy explored the importance of moderation in all things. Their art celebrated human achievement while acknowledging human limitations. They developed a culture that honored excellence while remaining wary of excess. The love stories in Greek mythology taught equally important lessons about the nature of human relationships. Love, they understood, was a creative force powerful enough to bring new life into existence, but it was also potentially destructive if not guided by wisdom and tempered by respect for others' autonomy. The tragedy of Orpheus and Eurydice showed that love must sometimes accept loss rather than trying to control or possess what it cherishes. Pygmalion's story revealed that love could literally create life, but also warned about the dangers of preferring fantasy to reality. The myth of Echo and Narcissus demonstrated how love could become corrupted into obsession when it lost touch with genuine connection to another person. These stories taught that healthy love required seeing and accepting others as they truly were, not as idealized versions of what we wanted them to be. They showed that love's greatest power came not from possession, but from the willingness to sacrifice for another's happiness, even when that sacrifice caused personal pain. The Greeks also understood that individual actions had consequences far beyond their immediate effects. The war between gods and titans affected every aspect of existence. Pandora's curiosity shaped the entire human condition. Paris's choice of Aphrodite over Hera and Athena led to the destruction of Troy and the deaths of countless heroes. This awareness of interconnectedness made the Greeks careful about their choices. They developed elaborate systems of ethics based on understanding that every action sent ripples through the complex web of relationships that connected all living things. Honor wasn't just about personal reputation, but about maintaining the trust that allowed communities to function. The myths also revealed the Greeks' sophisticated understanding of time and change. They recognized that the cosmos went through cycles, golden ages followed by periods of decline, which were followed by renewal and rebirth. Nothing, not even divine rule, was permanent. This understanding made them resilient in the face of disasters and modest during periods of prosperity. Perhaps most importantly, these stories taught that meaning could be found even in a universe that often seemed hostile or indifferent to human concerns. The heroes who achieved immortality through their deeds didn't do so by avoiding death, but by choosing to act in ways that made their brief lives significant. Heracles gained divine status not because he was stronger than death, but because he used his strength to help others. Perseus became legendary not because he was invulnerable, but because he faced impossible odds to protect innocent people. These heroes found ways to create value through their choices, to leave the world better than they found it, despite knowing their time in it was limited. The myths suggested that this was perhaps the most human characteristic of all, the ability to create meaning through conscious choice, to find purpose in temporary existence, to build something lasting out of materials that were themselves ephemeral. These ancient insights remain remarkably relevant in our modern world. We still struggle with questions about the responsible use of power, still grapple with the complexities of love and loss, still search for meaning in lives that we know are finite. We still see leaders whose greatest strengths become their greatest weaknesses, still witness how individual choices can have vast unintended consequences, still need stories that acknowledge life's complexity while suggesting that wisdom and virtue remain possible. The Greek myths endure because they offer no easy answers, but rather the right questions, no simple formulas, but rather wisdom earned through careful observation of human nature in all its glory and failure. They remind us that we are part of a larger story, that our choices matter even when we can't control their outcomes, and that courage, love, and wisdom remain the best tools we have for navigating an uncertain universe. As these ancient voices prepare to fade back into the silence from which we called them tonight, they leave us with perhaps their most important gift, the understanding that being human means living with mystery, finding beauty in temporary things, and creating meaning through the conscious choice to care for something larger than ourselves. As our journey through these timeless stories draws to a gentle close, we find ourselves enriched by the wisdom of voices that have been speaking across the centuries, their words as fresh and relevant tonight as they were when first told under starlit skies in ancient Greece. These myths have shown us gods who were magnificently flawed, heroes who found greatness through struggle, and lovers whose devotion could reshape the very fabric of reality. We've witnessed the birth of the cosmos from primordial chaos, seen the rise and fall of divine dynasties, walked with mortals whose courage earned them places among the eternal stars. We've learned that power without wisdom leads to destruction, that love without understanding can become obsession, and that true heroism lies not in avoiding failure, but in choosing to act with honor despite the certainty of mortality. These stories have endured for 3 millennia because they capture something essential about what it means to be conscious in a vast and mysterious universe. They acknowledge that life is difficult, that suffering is real, that the forces that shape our existence often seem beyond our control. But they also insist that meaning can be created through choice, that beauty can emerge from struggle, and that love, however brief and fragile, has the power to justify everything. The Greeks who first told these tales understood that the human condition is fundamentally tragic, not because life ends badly, but because it ends at all. Yet they also discovered that this brevity makes our choices more precious, not less, that the very temporariness of existence gives weight and significance to every act of courage, every moment of compassion, every decision to create rather than destroy. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you carry with you the echoes of these ancient insights. Perhaps you'll dream of heroes setting forth on impossible quests, of gods walking among mortals in disguise, of lovers whose devotion transcended death itself. In those dreams, you might find reflections of your own journey through a world that remains as full of wonder and danger as it was when these stories were first told. The myths remind us that we are all heroes of our own stories, faced with choices that will define not just our individual fates, but the kind of world we leave for those who come after us. We may not have divine powers or legendary strength, but we have something the ancient Greeks recognized as equally precious: the ability to choose courage over fear, wisdom over ignorance, love over indifference. These timeless tales suggest that perhaps the most heroic act is simply to remain fully human in a universe that often seems to encourage us to become something less, to maintain our capacity for wonder in the face of cynicism, our commitment to justice despite frequent disappointment, our willingness to love despite the certainty of loss. As the last echoes of these ancient voices fade into silence, they leave us with a gift more valuable than any treasure: the understanding that our brief lives are part of a story larger than ourselves, that our choices ripple outward through time in ways we may never fully comprehend, and that the same forces that created gods and heroes still move within every human heart, waiting to be awakened by the right story, told at the right moment under the vast and eternal stars. Rest well, knowing that you are connected to this grand tradition of storytelling, that your own life is a myth in the making, and that tomorrow offers new opportunities to live up to the heroic potential that these timeless tales remind us lies within every human soul willing to embrace both the beauty and the burden of being truly alive.